if we're to take steps to make changes in our lives, specifically around the ways that we're thinking and the methods we want to apply, we have to first start with an ability to recognize our thoughts. To me, and this is my bias, it it screams an application of mindfulness. Well, actually, it quietly nods its head. Let me preface by saying this is not to say that therapy is bad or there's necessarily something that somebody needs therapy, they should get therapy. But one of the concerns that I have as a non-therapist, as I look at the application of methods like cognitive behavioral therapy or the ACT method, is that they all start from a recognition of our thoughts. And the concern I have about that is as a practicing meditator of some 10 years now, the orchestra that makes it sound like it's something beautiful, but the orchestra of thoughts that are going on inside any given person's mind is, yes, untenable, but also unrecognized in most cases. The average person going about willy-nilly doesn't even recognize all of the thoughts, let alone any one given thought that might be arising. And so if there's something fundamentally corrupt about my thinking, the first place I have to begin with most of these applications of therapy is an awareness of thought. That will manifest in a therapy session when I articulate these anomalous things we call thoughts. But that's just one. Our relationship with our thoughts is tough to measure. Thinking is not grammatical. There's not really a sentence structure. The thinking is actually a bit more like feeling. Feelings turn into thoughts when we recognize them and start to give them shape, and we start to think in sentences or even more articulate them. But what's going on in our minds is this cloud of perceptions and feelings that we tend to refer to as our thoughts. So it gets a bit muddy. Try to think of thoughts and feelings as models for what's happening in our mind. Neither are quite accurate in their description of what it is. But getting back to my point, there are some fundamental ways that one talks about mindfulness that are useful in structuring the way to a good way to understand this. And these are pretty sectarian in their relationship, and they apply to a wide variety of meditation practices. Whatever your foundation for meditation, most, if not all of these, begin with a dualistic approach to meditation. There are exceptions. There are esoteric applications of meditation in Eastern practices that do not begin with dualism, but most start with dualism. Dualism is something we all understand innately, at least in English, because the structure of English language tends to be dualistic. I am the subject, there's usually a verb, an action, and there's an object, whether it's time or a physical object or a goal. Objects and subjects, dualistic. Right? I'm here, it is there, whatever that is. And objects can be literally anything that isn't self. Typically, we're talking about the five senses: smells, sights, hearing, tastes. I'm doubling down here. In Eastern circles, we add in the activity of the mind, thoughts and feelings. Again, this is a model, but that is another arising object in our ability to be aware of what's arising. The ability to recognize any one given object is tough. the I'm going to say the symphony here, the orchestra, the however you want to put it, the storm of rising objects in our possible awareness is, by any reasonable definition, unrealistic. It takes beyond my level of meditation to really be aware of every single arising object. Just honing in on a singular sense, like hearing, and paying attention, we only need to focus for a short period of time to recognize that there are more subtle sounds going on in the world than we can actually pull into a single awareness. They're not orchestrated. They're not in harmony most of the time. Maybe there's a kind of natural harmony going on that's worth talking about, but they're distant. They're close. They make whizzing sounds, bumping sounds, popping sounds. Trying to simply just capture that one sense of hearing is challenging enough. And that's happening across all of the 5, or if you want to call it 6 senses, all of the time. And so the idea that somewhere in that hurricane, we're expected to recognize we're having this destructive thought about self, I'm not good enough, when it's not even arising in this concrete format, to me seems like a misstep in the challenge to recognize it and then do something about it. It is a deeply rooted problem to most of our approaches to trying to address those aspects of life that we find challenging. For most of us, it's just not going to happen. I'm not trying to be negative. I'm talking about what's plausible, what's real. We're going to really struggle to just on our own willy-nilly recognize what's arising in our minds. So this begs, what is the solution? And to me, in my experience, a mindfulness practice. Let me slow down and define mindfulness. Okay, mindfulness is, as a practice of meditation, is sitting with what is, essentially, in an oversimplified term. It is taking awareness, often at the start of a particular what's called a sense door. So sounds. I've already used sounds. I'm paying attention to, for some determined amount of time, 5, 10 minutes, even a minute, I'm paying attention only to what is noticeable as sounds. Over time, over the practice of the practice, one develops a better ability to recognize all the nuances of the sounds that are arising, all of the objects of the visual experience that are arising, all of the objects of the sense system that are constantly happening, that if we didn't ignore them, we might lose our minds. If we were constantly aware of everything that was arising, we might not be able to deal with it, a lot of us. That practice applied to our mind, to our thoughts and our feelings, is a place to start developing the ability to recognize the corrupt thoughts that come up for us all the time. And for those of us that are struggling with pervasive corrupt thinking, without some kind of mindfulness practice, the best we can hope for is that in a really, really expensive session with a coach or a therapist, we're able to articulate some shoddy version of a singular thought in a hurricane of thoughts in that moment when the hurricane's going all the time, and try to solve that one thought and wrangle something better out of it. It's just on numbers alone, it just doesn't sound like a good plan to me. As a mindfulness practitioner, I have found that I have a much greater and growing awareness of especially the non-productive or unwise thoughts that arise for me. They become a bit humorous over time. I just had a thought about being incapable of doing this, or I just had a thought about being the best possible person for this, or whatever that thought is. And from there, is our best chance. I'm open to being wrong. I'm open to there being some other way to recognizing our thoughts, but to me this seems like the best plan to begin with. If we're going to start with the foundations of what we need to understand before we can arrest, change, redirect our attention with our thinking, in regards to our thinking, it has to begin with mindfulness.